I would like to introduce Salla Saastamoinen. We know each other now for a couple of years because Mrs. Saastamoinen, please come. Mrs. Saastamoinen has been in charge of as a director of equality until since 2014 and until very recently. And she took over now the Directorate for Civil and Commercial Justice. And as such, she's still busy with the gender equality on boards, but from another angle, as you will certainly tell us more about that. And really, Mrs. Saastamoinen is a very qualified lawyer. She has several law degrees from different universities in Europe. And she has been a great supporter of the European Women on Boards project, for which we thank her very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So, dear Madam Chair, dear members of the European Women on Boards, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored by the invitation to deliver the keynote speech in today's event that marks a notable milestone in the activity of the European Women on Boards network. We are today launching the online talent pool database, as it was mentioned. This new initiative can only advance the underlying objective of the European Women on Boards project, the underlying objective of the European Commission, which is increasing the representation of women on companies' boards across Europe. And I cannot emphasize sufficiently or enough how important this project is personally for me and for the European Commission in general. Namely, as was mentioned, I'm looking at it from the two perspectives. I was fortunate enough to work with the equality in the European Union until recently, until September. And in that position, we addressed the matter from the gender equality perspective. In my new position, leading the company law and corporate governance, I look at the matter primarily now from the good governance angle. And the gender equality is an issue that once you have worked with the matter, it follows always you in the new position, so important to continue. We do have an ample of evidence that having more women on boards would be very welcome to the European business environment. For the number of years now, in increasing number of studies, and we saw already there are 2 studies also done by the European Women on Boards, the studies suggest that the women's presence on the board enhances the performance of the companies. So it's not only the gender equality, it is how our European companies do business, how we in Europe create a business environment for the more growth and jobs, which is then the priority for the European Commission and European Union currently. Also, in general, the board that is diverse is more likely to exercise effective oversight and decision-making and to counter the groupthink phenomenon. A diverse composition of the company's leading bodies should facilitate the independent opinions and critical challenge that contributes to enhancing the company's governance and robustness. This is particularly important in today's world facing critical sustainability challenge. We have the climate change going on. We are talking about the resource efficiency, demographic changes, economic crisis, unsustainable production and consumption patterns. And in all these environments, the companies should look on the future and think, how are we going to manage in a sustainable way? There is some evidence from the various studies that show that boards which have more women are more likely to care about the sustainability risks and respond more positively to sustainability opportunities. All in all, sustainability is very high in the political agenda today. The Commission has recently announced work for a regulatory reform aiming to make the financial sector more aware and responsive to the sustainable risks and opportunities. If investors espouse sustainability, companies will be more sustainable. We have recently carried out in the European Commission a public consultation on sustainable investment, and that shows that corporate accountability for sustainability is yet in very, very early stages, really infant yet. And there's a need on improving the corporate governance in this area. So next, I will actually talk then on the diversity in the financial sector. In the Commission, we have a specific approach for the diversity in the banking sector legislation. And this is a concrete example of the actions taken in order to enhance the diversity in boards with a specific focus on the gender dimension. And I here talk of the case of the largest financial institutions. This is all more relevant considering that, as shown, for example, by the most recent study or report of the Oliver Wyman, a big consultancy who's looking on these matters, that report shows that women's representation in the financial sector top position is still far from where all of us here believe it should be. The issue of the women boards in the financial sector came to the attention of the European Union and the Commission when we revised our central piece of legislation in this area, the Capital Requirements Directive, and this was done in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. In that context, it was found that the weaknesses in the bank's internal governance, including a weak oversight by the board of directors and insufficient consideration of risks, these were believed to contribute or had been contributing to the accumulation of those excessive risks in the financial system and ultimately also to the crisis. Our that time Commissioner and our Vice President Viviane Reding quoted often that we wouldn't have been there if the Lehman Brothers would have been Lehman Sisters. So the revision of the EU banking legislation in 2013 aimed at addressing these corporate governance weaknesses through a series of measures. The purpose of these measures was to enhance the fitness of the boards to fulfill their duties. The board members now in the largest financial institutions are required to be of sufficiently good repute, to commit sufficient time to their functions, and to possess adequate knowledge and skills in order to perform their duties and to understand the risks the bank may be exposed to. In addition to these fit and proper obligations, as they are called, the directive asks that the notion of diversity to be taken into account when selecting board members. So, in addition or moreover, all banks which are covered by this directive, they are required to put in place a policy promoting diversity on their boards and to regularly disclose that policy, its objectives, and the assessment to the extent of which the targets have been met. Specifically, with regard to the gender, this EU directive requires that the largest European banks are setting a target to the female representation on their boards and to adopt the policy describing how these targets are met. Then the banks monitor, and these banks must regularly disclose these targets and the policy to the public. So it is also the transparency of their corporate governance. And that transparency also then is covering the diversity practices. That should and it might introduce certain peer pressure to perform better in terms of gender representation. In this financial sector, we have the European Banking Authority, who is then also monitoring the situation in the Europe. And the European Banking Authority has recently examined how banks have so far applied the diversity rules. Its findings are reflected in the report of the European Banking Authority that was published last summer. And the report shows that, again, the situation is not sufficiently good. There's a room for improvement. For instance, only around 1/3 of the sampled banks had a diversity policy in place. And around 1/5 of the sampled banks had board members, and 1/5 of the board members of the sampled banks were women, so around 20%. Again, here we do not have a European level target, but the banks have to set the target themselves in order then to increase the number of the women in their boards. Within the Commission, we are currently looking all this data, and we have an also obligation to make a monitoring and the report under the directive, and we are drafting the report currently. So the Commission will publish its views by the end of the year concerning the diversity in the banking sector. We are still only beginning to observe the effects and influence of these rules, which have been there since 2014. So it's a couple of years' time, a period that they had to be applied so far. So we are confident that they will bring their contribution and they will improve the situation to have a more balanced gender representation in the boards of the financial institutions. And in the meanwhile, I'm fully convinced that all the measures, such as those of the European Women in Boards, will help to make a difference and will drive for positive change. So we need the tools like the talent pool to provide also the financial sector to have the choices for their board members. We saw that there has been the surveys, there's a knowledge center. I would like to thank really deeply the European Women on Boards of all these actions will support then our legislative measures. So ladies and gentlemen, to finish, I mentioned something about this general targets of the increasing women on boards. It was mentioned we have the proposal for the attaining a 40% representation of women in the non-executive board positions in the last publicly listed companies, so in general. This is in the table of the negotiations in the Council and in the Parliament now for 3 years. And the aim is indeed, again, to have a better gender balance. Commission thinks it's a priority initiative. It still is in our work programs. However, in the Council, we have been blocked now for around 1 year. Everybody says that they share the objective of increasing the gender balance, but when one comes to the practice, they disagree on the means to get there. However, already the existence of the Commission proposal has led to the national discussions and legislations. So during the time when the proposal is there are many countries who actually went further than the proposal and created national quota legislations. And we see the improvement in the numbers of the women on boards of the companies in the European level. So that way we remain positive that this progress continues. We are continuing the negotiations concerning the proposal, and the next presidency, the Maltese Council presidency, who is there for the first half of 2017, has promised to prioritize the file and make a progress towards its adoption. So the work continues. To finish, I'd like to quote our Commissioner for Justice and Gender Equality, Vera Jourova, who has said that the gender equality is not an option, it's not a luxury, it is an imperative and it is a competitive advantage. Equal representation on corporate boards is well overdue. I have every confidence that besides our regulatory actions, all the work done by the associations, volunteers, and the actors like the European Women on Boards Network will be instrumental of achieving our common goals of increasing the women on boards in Europe. Thank you for your attention.